start to realize that film is the sum of editing, then and editing is the thing you're always looking at.
Showtime, folks.
I think great editing skill will protect a director from suicide.
The first filmmakers simply photographed what interested or amused them. They held a shot until they got bored, or the film ran out.
The fathers of cinema, Edison in the United States and the Lumiere brothers in France, were very pessimistic about the future of cinema. There was probably a worldwide interest in seeing these images move, but once you'd seen somebody playing a joke with a hose, why pay money to see something that you can see for real out in the street? In fact, Auguste Lumiere went as far as to say that cinema was an invention without a future.
But Edwin Porter, one of Thomas Edison's employees, proved him wrong. Porter discovered that cutting separate shots together could create a story.
Edwin S. Porter really was the one with the Life of an American Fireman, I think, that started intercutting and creating an emotional impact in the audience by intercutting two shots that are not related to each other. One scene is going on at one place, basically the firemen rushing to a fire with their horse-drawn wagons, and the other scene is the fire, miles away. You intercut the two, and you understand psychologically and emotionally that these people's lives are in danger, and these people are coming to rescue them, and you're rooting all of a sudden for that to happen, and you're hoping they save the people. I often think about what it must have been like to be there to create the art form as it was happening, and say, why don't we try this? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, we do it in the editing room now. We cut to something and say, well, that doesn't work. Well, imagine what they must have said in 1904.
The Great Train Robbery was Porter's next film. That's when you really begin to see the possibilities. And I'm not saying this because I'm an editor, but the invention of editing is the thing that allowed film to take off. It's the equivalent of the invention of flight. Both human-powered flight and motion picture editing were invented in the same year, and they have similar kinds of effects.
The invention of editing gave birth to a new art and a new language. A language that can transport us in the blink of an eye from the vastness of the desert to the mysteries of the human face. A cut can bridge millions of years, connecting the prehistoric past to an imaginary future. Editing can slow down time or speed it up. The timing of a cut can startle audiences.
I'm cleaning out a crooked laundry, see? Little do
Or
I know
amuse
it,
them.
But there's a dope fiend with a long knife trailing after me. I'm in great danger.
I'll never let go. I promise.
The choice and length of shots shape our response to everything we see on the screen.
And editing is why people like movies, because in the end, wouldn't we like to edit our own lives? I think we would. I think everybody would like to take out the bad parts, take out the slow parts, and look deeper into the good parts.
I started working on what used to be called the upright moviola, which is a machine, editing machine that looks something like a green sewing machine on legs. I switched to computer editing in the mid-90s. The editor has to be, he's sort of the ombudsman for the audience. As an editor, you only see what is on the screen, not what was going on at the time of shooting. And that's how it's going to look to the audience. I make it a principle not to go on the set, not to see the actors out of costume, not to see anything other than the images that come to me from location.
A major Hollywood production shoots almost 200 hours of film. Unspooled, the film would stretch from LA to Vegas. An editor may work for months, even years, crafting this footage into a 2-hour movie. The finished film will contain thousands of shots, each measured in frames of 1/24th of a second.
For a writer, it's a word, all right? For a composer or a musician, it's a note, all right? For an editor and a filmmaker, it's the frames, all right? And you know, the 1 frame off or 2 frames added or 2 frames less is the difference between a sour note and a sweet note. It's the difference between clunky, clumsy crap, all right, and orgasmic rhythm.
Verna Fields made many good contributions to Jaws. We all referred to Verna Fields as Mother Cutter because she was very earthy and very maternal. She cut her films at her house, in her pool house in the San Fernando Valley, and it was a very Hamish kind of workplace. The shark didn't work as well or as often as it was supposed to work according to the screenplay.
That's the spot.
We had a contest where Verna would stop the moviola on a frame where she wanted to make the cut, and I would stop it where I wanted to make the cut. And if ever we stopped it on the same frame that had already been marked with a grease pencil X, we knew that was the right frame on certain things where we didn't agree. And all of our disagreements always happened with that darn shark. Verna was always in favor of making less to be more. And I was trying to squeeze that one more, because it took me days to get the one shot. So I'm going back to, I'm on a barge for 2 days trying to get the shark to look real. And the sad fact was the shark would only look real in 36 frames, not 38 frames. And that 2-frame difference was the difference between something really scary and something that looked like a great white floating turd.
Out of my way.
Well, I got so desperate on Terminator 2, trying to shorten that film to a manageable length, as we all understand that to be, that I said, well, wait a minute, do we really need all these frames? If we just took out 1 frame every second for the entire film, we'd shorten the film by a couple of minutes. Let's just do it as a test. We'll take a reel, and we'll take out 1 frame in every 24. And the editors looked at me like I was nuts. Let's just try it. Come on, nobody's ever done this. We took out 1 frame in every 24, and it was a mess. There were jerks, there were things, there were cuts in the wrong places. You totally saw it, and it just didn't work. Every one of those individual frames was important. Once you know that as an editor, now you get scared for a while. It's like, geez, am I cutting here or am I cutting here? But then after a while, you start to realize that there's great power in that, too.
D.W. Griffith was the first great filmmaker to understand the psychological importance of editing. Working a decade after Porter, he did more than anyone else to advance the storytelling tools Porter had developed. Griffith invented and popularized techniques that established the basic grammar of film. His melodramas were the first to draw audiences into the emotional world of his characters.
He certainly was the first man to use the close-up in a big way.
This was revolutionary. It was so revolutionary that the producers, when they saw this, were aghast. They thought, you can't put this picture out like this. You can't cut to this big, ugly shot of somebody. First of all, we're paying for this actor, this actress. We want to see their whole body. We don't want to just see their face. Second of all, the audiences won't know what to respond to. They're going to be all confused. Well, the proof is in the pudding, and the reality is that the audiences were not confused at all.
Griffith brought it together in one magnificent film, Birth of a Nation, and we saw the accumulation of sort of 10 years of editing knowledge put into a movie. And all of a sudden, you had not only had close-ups, but you had flashbacks, parallel action, and you had all sorts of things that he used to make the audience, his attention focused on a certain part of the frame.
D.W. Griffith established the tenets of classical film editing. And classical film editing relied on the concept of the invisible cut, in which action would always be continuous and fluid and moving.
The goal was to mask the cut so the audience wouldn't notice and could forget that they were watching a movie. Let's take another look. Notice how the gesture matches from one shot to the next? Griffith's seamless editing is still practiced today and was the dominant editing style in Hollywood movies for decades.
At last.
Look again. The cut is so smooth that it's barely noticeable.
It's all for telling the story. And all you want to do is get the person emotionally invested in the story. So it becomes this invisible craft.
We call it the invisible art. And indeed, it is. I mean, the more invisible we are, the better we're doing our job.
Unfortunately, the invisible style of editing kept editors invisible and unappreciated as well. For years, they have been the best-kept secret of the movies. The first cutters were considered hands for hire rather than creative partners in the filmmaking process. They looked at the images by holding the film up to the light. Then they would check their work by running it through a projector and making the necessary adjustments. Griffith's main cutter was Jimmy Edward Smith, who virtually lived with him at the studio, where they worked far into the night, running the film shot during the day. Later, Smith's wife Rose joined the editing team. The Smiths married during the cutting of Intolerance. For their honeymoon, Griffith allowed them the weekend off. In the 1930s, movies became an even bigger business. The movie studios introduced sound films and radically reshaped movie making. Hollywood retooled itself on the model of the factory assembly line. The studios cranked out movies with almost the same speed that Henry Ford mass-produced cars. I don't want it good, Jack Warner declared. I want it Tuesday.
You now needed an industrial system to make this all work. In the first 20, 25, 30 years of cinema, large numbers of editors were women. It was considered to be a woman's job because it was something like knitting, it was something like tapestry, sewing, that you took these pieces of fabric, which is what film are, and you put them together. It was when sound came in that the men began to infiltrate the ranks of the editors because sound was somehow electrical. It was technical. It was no longer knitting.
There is the soundtrack, which might be several tracks, and the image. And without the happy marriage of those two, you're not using every bit of potential that you possibly can in editing a movie.
The scene in Horse Whisperer where Sam Neill and Kristen Scott Thomas there's an argument results because she is going to leave. The intent of the scene was to show that the marriage was foundering. And it was dialogue basically overlapping as they were speaking, so they were both mic'd. To make it even more dramatic, I even took out more air and made the overlaps more intense. I could do that because I had separate tracks to work with.
Are you a psychiatrist? He says it takes time.
Well, I don't care what he says. I cannot sit here and pretend everything's going to be all right.
I am
we
not
have to
pretending.
Do something.
I am trusting in
we
people who
are
know more
losing,
about this than we do.
We are losing her.
In effect, by taking out all of the air in that particular dialogue scene, it did have kind of a suffocating effect because there was no respite. There was no air there. You couldn't take it. You couldn't draw a breath, and it became that much more intense.
After World War II, Hollywood continued to make movies in the same way it had before the war. Although editors were now unionized, they were viewed for the most part as highly skilled mechanics.
There was a man named Owen Marks. He edited The Petrified Forest, Casablanca, Treasure of Sierra Madre, East of Eden, and his films are immortal, and the man is completely unknown. And it's sort of symbolic of the way editors have been ignored in the literature about Hollywood.
Editors worked on cutter's row and were expected to conform to the established rules of editing.
If we were to think about the films that were being made, there was a certain film language that was very, very distinct. Certain kinds of coverage, long shot, two shot, single, single. There was almost a formulaic way of presenting films. This film language was very strict. And in editorial terms, there were rules that one felt could not be broken.
A master shot had to come first, and then if you had an overshoulder, you went to the overshoulder, and you never went to the close-up till you'd done the whole dance coming from far to close.
For instance, if you were going to have a transition from one place to the next, it would be done with a dissolve.
Next thing you've got to remember is that a gentleman you meet among the cold cuts is simply not as attractive as one that you meet, say, in the mink department at Bergdorf's.
In the 40s and 50s, the audience would expect a character to drive up, show him getting out of the car, he would walk up to the building, and then he would open the door, and then the editor would match cut the door opening on the other side, and he would walk in and come over and sit down.
Pull up a chair. Thanks.
It just seemed to me absolutely stupid that you had to show somebody coming down the stairs and all the way across the road and up the other side. I mean, you knew that they were coming from here and they were going to there. Why couldn't you just cut direct?
An encounter with two swords 30 years ago would have been probably done in a master shot and a couple of exchanges. Today, that encounter could evolve into 200 shots. Split-second eye blink, a blade going into a chest, slight movement of a wrist. So the audience is taken right down into this roller coaster ride of minutiae, and that's what they want.
Because kids today are raised on television and in MTV and commercials, they not only can process information faster and understand what images mean, but that they demand it.
I think the MTV generation in the 80s kind of created this style of editing. And Billy Weber and I on Top Gun, we were pushed in that direction. Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simmons were very much in tune with their audiences. They felt that that was what the audiences liked, and I think they were proven right, given the box office on some of those early movies.
And I mean, fast cutting was not invented now or with MTV. Just look at Lou Lombardo's work on The Wild Bunch.
Sometimes a cutting style is effective inside of a movie to shake you up and rattle your soul, but consistently to have that style pounding away at you like a metronome on high speed for 2.5 hours is a little bit, at least for me, maybe I'm just getting old, but it's a little bit debilitating. Now, it doesn't bother my kids, because my kids were raised on 30-second commercials and on MTV and VH1, and they were raised on video games.
I feel like I was born 80 and I'm growing backwards. So now I'm somewhere around 27, I get a tattoo and I'm feeling closer to a generation that has learned to absorb information at a speed that was heretofore unthinkable, and where their rhythms are well more hungry than a traditional narrative pace.
What I'm afraid of is the tendency for everything to go by quickly. And I'm afraid of what it does to the culture. A sense of consuming something and throwing it away, as opposed to being enveloped with something. Taking the time to see and experience time in a different way.
Editing is like poetry. It has to do with rhythms. It has to do with visual. It's visual poetry.
The digital revolution has further enhanced the poetic powers of the editor. George Lucas, who began his career as an editor, is one of the pioneers of this new technology.
All art is technology. That's the very nature of it. The artist is always bumping against that technology. And the advent of, whether it's a new color of blue, whether it's a proscenium arch, whatever it is, it changes the way we work in that art form.
With computer technology, editors now can make changes within the frame, adding or removing elements from the original image. This increases the editor's control, but also multiplies the number of decisions to be made.
Now you can edit what I call in 3D, which is you have a scene and you have people in the scene, and you can cut those people out, you can move them around in the scene, you can go in for a close-up, you can go out. You can sort of direct the film in the editing room, which is, growing up as an editor, what I've always wanted to do.
The new technology also makes it possible to cut the movie before shooting begins. Pre-visualization gives an editor much more input in planning the movie.
And I have a system now, because of the digital world, I have a group of kids really do little videomatics of things, and we have a little blue screen. We can send these editors in and shoot scenes on just an amateur video camera. And so I can actually shoot the film and make the film and write the film right there in the editing room. Every main character in our movie has a digital counterpart. We have totally virtual actors now, and we use them quite a bit. Mostly we use them for stunts and things. We have a lot of situations where it's better to use a digital actor than it is to use a real actor. Christopher Lee, who's 80 years old, he can't really fight the way he did in Attack of the Clones. You're not going to get an artificial intelligence computer that's neurotic enough to be able to understand how you create a performance. Performance is an art.
At the end of the day, all this stuff has to work to tell a story. And if you're not telling a story, it doesn't matter how much razzle-dazzle there is. It's not about the tools, it's about the story.
In many ways, we're the last storyteller. The movie has been written by the writer, and then it's directed, and then it comes to the last storytelling, which is in the editing process.
The last draft of the screenplay is the first cut of the movie, and the final cut of the movie is the last draft of the script.
An editor can take a sequence that a director shot and reconfigure it in such a way that it becomes a whole different sequence, which is much more beneficial to the movie.